First of all, I would like to thank the invitation of ICOMOS India to be present here in this seminar. I will start with the two previous notes, if you allow me. First one is to say that I'm not really a specialist in Indo-Portuguese architecture. Anyhow, I will try my best, and I try to share some of my knowledge with you. The second is that to make it more clear, my presentation, and to get a better control on time, I will read the notes I prepared. Okay, so the final purpose of my presentation is, or the approach I selected, is I will try to give a historical perspective of the Portuguese experience in India, and through it get a more readable understanding of the current situation of this particular building heritage. Starting from the very beginning, let me remind you that the sea route from the Atlantic to the Indian Ocean was sailed for the first time in 1498. Two main reasons led the Portuguese to reach India by sea. Evangelization of the Indian people, and economic and social development for the Portuguese through trading of spices, mostly. I must confess that in those days, that purpose seemed very fair enough for the Portuguese, and not for the Indians. Anyhow, this meant at the occasion the achievement of a long and systematically developed project, sustained and encouraged by the ground, and that sets back to the beginning of the 15th century with the realization of the first expedition through the Atlantic Ocean. However, upon arriving in India, the Portuguese faced it with an unexpected reality. In fact, very little was seen of what was expected, except the riches. Moreover, and contrary to Africa, it was the first time that Portuguese came face to face with civilizations that had reached a level of progress similar to that of Europe, with settlements integrated into strong states and stable and well-organized urban networks. This fact had certainly an extreme relevance in terms of the Portuguese settlements. In order to surpass these difficulties, the Portuguese quickly realized that would have to establish stable bases to make local contacts possible, and acting as a network guarantee control of maritime traffic. This strategy was possible due to the fact that the potentates of the subcontinent had systems of continental logic with no relevant fleets, and consequently a weak authority in the coastal routes and ports. In fact, were the Muslim merchants who had the main influence on the system that supplied the caravans between the Persian Gulf, the Red Sea and Europe. And for this reason, it's not surprising that the main opposition to the Portuguese was, in fact, from the Muslim merchants rather than the locals. Kochi, signalized in the map, was chosen as the first center of Portuguese operations in the Orient after the arrival to Calcut in 1498. The procedure was similar to those tried before on African coast. First, a permission to establish a trading post on the outskirts of pre-existing urban nucleus was obtained. Then, a fortification was immediately erected, and finally the church and a potential Portuguese settlement of people followed, in some cases giving rise to a Portuguese profile of urban nucleus, as for example was the case of Kochi. The places chosen were always open to the sea and closed as much as possible to the land, preferably islands, capes, or peninsulas. In short, the whole system was based on four foundations in the first years: tax-safe contacts, the so-called cartazes, fleets, trading posts, and fortresses. The conquest of Goa, The conquest of Goa in 1510 and of Malacca in 1511 led to the centralization of the still incipient state of India in Goa, followed by a general strategic rethinking of the expansion, now clearly within the logic of the consolidation of an empire. This goal was consubstantiated with the increment of the territorial dimension of Goa in 1543, when adjacent mainland areas joined the highland of Tiswadi, and the subsequent movement northward, namely to the rich Gulf of Kambat, the so-called northern province, with its seat at Bassein, a town taken at the end of 1534, such as Bombay, and the subsequent integration of Diu in 1535 and Daman in 1569, among others. In the southern India, the Portuguese presence was less consolidated, with the eventual exception of Ceylon between the beginning of the 16th century and the mid of the 17th century. On what concerned this particular region, Bengal, the Portuguese presence was even less effective, and mainly due to the action of the church, for one side, and of the so-called lançados. In English, something like the launched or the released, should be the name, that were merchants and adventurers with no institutional link to the state of India. This fact explains the very few examples of Portuguese architecture existing in this area when compared with other regions of India. In short, we may divide the Portuguese presence in the Orient into three main periods. The first of these periods, initiated in 1498 and ending circa 1650, can be seen as one of expansion, considered up to the decade of 1540 with arrival in Japan, followed by a phase of consolidation. The second can be considered as a period of stabilization and goes from circa 1650 up to 1740, with the loss of the northern province, except for the cities of Daman and Diu, following the arrival of other European nations, namely Holland, Britain, and France, and the subsequent attacks to the Portuguese possessions, resulting in this new map. Finally, the third period, which goes from 1740 up to 1961, corresponds to the reorganization of the state of India, now restricted to the territories of Goa, Daman, and Diu. At this point, we must recall one of the major motivations that led the Portuguese to reach India by sea, evangelization, and consequently enhance the great influence of the church, mainly through the action of the so-called Portuguese padroado, which was more widespread and enduring than that of the state, and with a presence in vast areas where no direct administrative jurisdiction of the crown occurred. In fact, the role played by the religious orders, mainly Franciscans and Jesuits, but also Augustinians, Dominicans, Carmelites, and so on, as direct administrative delegated by the state of India of large areas of territory, had obvious implications in terms of the religious architecture, whose presence is somehow still notable nowadays, particularly in locals where a Catholic congregation has been implemented. Equally relevant was the action of the military engineers in the whole of this process, and similarly with the religious architecture, for reasons of scale, investment and the quality of construction, most of the military buildings, such as fortresses or bastions, have survived until nowadays, although sometimes only as ruins. In the middle of the 16th century, in order to deal with the progress of ballistic, the crown adopted the bulwark or bastion system, and in the following years, a renovation of the defensive system was envisaged in several places and territories according to the strategy then adopted. It is interesting to notice that, with rare exceptions, those were the territories that managed to remain under Portuguese domination in face of the attacks that occurred following the arrival of other European nations. Apart their involvement in the construction of military facilities, the military engineers were also involved in the definition of urban interventions, and in the absence of alternatives, they also provided technical assessment for civil and religious constructions. In short, they were the technical backup support to implement any kind of strategic territorial policy, and has been so in all the Portuguese territories. On what concerns civil and domestic architecture or equipment and infrastructures, they almost disappeared, with some exceptions in the cases of Goa, Daman, and Dio, places where the Portuguese presence was maintained until 1961. It is interesting to notice that because of this long-term presence, even good examples of modernist architecture can be found, due to its ability to adjust the principles of international modernism to the local climate and the fundamental aspects of local culture. It must be stressed also that even in those places as Daman, Goa or Cochin, among others, where the first buildings were similar to those erected in Portugal, a natural and long-term appropriation by the local population occurred, with the inevitable transformation resultant from the assumption of their own idiosyncrasies. In these particular cases that is shown in this picture, the use of color, for example, is a real distinctive from the Portuguese tradition. All this considered, it is questionable if we can talk of Indo-Portuguese architecture with well-established character, considering the obvious differences between, for instance, the Catholic architecture of Portuguese origin or influence of the North Province and that from Goa or Bengal. On the contrary, we should emphasize the need to consider the existence of regional threats that deserve their own taxonomy. Concluding, in result of the enhanced cultural interaction occurred, it's not always easy to establish what can be considered as being of Portuguese origin, particularly in cases where evidence of materiality is not clearly observed. In such cases, a balanced consideration of the commission, authoring, or formal expression would eventually help us to establish that condition and helpfully mitigate the damages of actual and not funded interventions. A few words more about the churches and convents of Goa that since 1986 integrates the UNESCO World Heritage List. It includes a set of Catholic buildings that were erected mostly in the end of the 16th century and along the 17th century. Particularly relevant in this set of churches and convents are the Céu de Goa, which is the largest Portuguese cathedral in the world, and presents the same typology of several rival cathedrals built in Portugal, such, for instance, the Sé of Porto Alegre that is shown in this picture. The Basilica do Bom Jesus, belonging to the Jesuit order, and the Church of San Francisco de Assis of the Franciscans also deserves mention, since they also became a standard for other religious constructions in India. After this small incursion on the Portuguese origin architecture in India, I will try in the remaining minutes to address the treatment of this shared built heritage in science, focusing my attention in archives, research and teaching in universities, official governmental policy, and cooperation and funding from Portuguese institutions. Recently, on the occasion of the commemoration of 500 years of the discoveries, the historiographical treatment of this matter was remarkably renewed, updating in a significant way the collection of existing works on this subject. However, very few of that renewed research were as focused on the subject of Portuguese architecture and urban planning in India. An important exception resulted from a Carlos Gulbenkian Foundation financing the project entitled Portuguese heritage in the world, architecture and urbanism. The most salient result of the work then carried out has been the realization of the website shown here in the picture, whose consultation I advise to all of you interested in this matter. In the universities, the interest in the subject was also found some echo. Unfortunately, the great majority of the works produced are in Portuguese, which naturally makes it difficult, its dissemination abroad. Thus, focusing for obvious reasons my attention on authors who, being relevant, have been publishing some of their work in English or in some cases in French, I would like to highlight the work of Walter Rossa, coordinator of the Carlos Gulbenkian Foundation project, already mentioned, with a particular emphasis on themes related to the Portuguese urban heritage, as well as Elder Carita, devoted mainly to the study of Indo-Portuguese civil architecture. Concerning the archives, the National Archives in Torre do Tombo and the National Ultramarine Archive in the Ajuda Library and are worth mentioning among many others dispensed by numerous institutions, just like National Library of Portugal, Lisbon Academy of Science, Lisbon Geographic Society, and so on. In the international field, a particular reference must be made to the Historic Archive of Goa, the Patriarchal Curia of Goa, and the National Library of Rio de Janeiro in Brazil. To these three archives, certainly the most prominent, we would also add the Brazilian Historical and Geographical Institute, the Archives of Propaganda Fide in Rome, the Xavier Center of Historical Research in Goa, the Indian Office of the British Library, and the Fonds Portugais of the Bibliothèque Nationale de France. With reference to non-governmental organizations, the highlight will be addressed to the Fundação Orient, in addition to the Fundação Carlos Gulbenkian already mentioned here. Finally, informally questioned on this matter, the DGPC, the governmental entity responsible for safeguarding architectural heritage in Portugal, expressed its disponibility to collaborate with international organizations and entities, but without embracing a proactive policy in this area. Concluding, I would like to emphasize that knowledge is the key to any well-established intervention, and consequently, there is a significant amount of work to be done. The Center for Studies in Architecture and Urbanism of FAUP will naturally be available and interested in collaborating with all those devoted to the study of such a challenging as operative research field. Thank you very much.